Boom here. We are, yeah. So everybody, welcome to our Wednesday night soup supper. This is a practice that we have during Lent. And we also do a first Wednesday soup and speaker night. So we kind of have a combination of those tonight with Pastor Dr. Megan Rohrer. I've known Megan for probably 4 or 5 years, mostly on Megan wants to do this, I need to help make it happen. So that's been our relationship, which I find always a great place to start a relationship. So I've worked on the tech side of working with Megan on Synod assemblies and the Western States Gathering, and found it a great joy to work with them. And was part of a ministry in times of crisis Zoom a couple weeks ago that my friend Desta has been doing. And Megan was one of the presenters. And as I was listening to that, was moved by their wisdom and passion. And I was like, that's something I really want to share with Bethel. So they're pastor at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, and also a chaplain for the SFPD. So with that, Megan, why don't you share a bit with us and let's take this for a ride.
Sure. I'll also let you know that in the beginning, I'm going to talk about the most hard to talk about parts about like death and numbers that have happened at the coronavirus. But I promise you might have guessed from knowing Tom that I'm not 100% serious all of the time. Would that be a nice way to say it? Right. And
Sure.
So we're going to talk about this in a serious way, in a way that doesn't disrespect people, but not in a way that leaves you crumpled in a ball, hopefully, and crying at the end of this. Does that sound fair? But we are going to talk about death and about grief. My hunch is that you might know that already, but I just wanted to give you a heads up in case you didn't know. So let's start out kind of talking about some of the numbers so that we can just get that out there. Originally, there were some predictions that during this coronavirus, it might be as many as 1.5 million people in the United States that die by the end of this virus. Some of those numbers have been revised. The current estimate is between 100,000 and 250,000, but that's with the assumption that everyone in the United States shelters in place until the end of June. Okay, so we don't really know what's going to happen, how numbers will shift. We also don't know what happens after we stop sheltering in place, if we go through this again or if we don't go through this again. So much of the numbers is unknown, but what we do know is that the number of people who are expected to die by the end of this is closer to how many people die in a war than how many people typically would die from an illness, at least in one really short period of time. And so our grief practice might be a little bit bigger. I don't know if any of you have been following the numbers, but today's numbers, they report them every day at 4 o'clock, are that we have currently had 14,687 individuals who have died. And that multiply that times 15 people at least who loved each one of those people. So the number of people who are grieving right now is pretty astounding. What we don't know is how many people fully have died because of the coronavirus. There's also 28,475 people whose death has been classified as a death of pneumonia, who were not tested for the coronavirus, whom we do not know. So the CDC actually keeps a list of the numbers of people they know for sure have died of the coronavirus, alongside numbers of people who have died from pneumonia, because they're just not entirely sure. Part of that reasoning is because different counties in the United States have different ways that they deal with death. Some places have medical examiners, like we have here in San Francisco. Other places have coroners. Medical examiners are trained medical professionals who typically have training in forensic scientist studies. They know how to check if and do tests and check what kinds of ways people have died, and their death certificates tend to be on the more medical side. They do all of the investigating. Coroners, on the other hand, tend to be elected and don't always have job descriptions once they are elected. Some counties might not even have morgue facilities. It might just be a place where someone has purchased a refrigerator. They might have only space to care for one person at a time because they're a smaller location. And prior to this crisis, it might have taken them as long as 4 to 6 months to produce a death notification of how that person passed away. So there's a lot of numbers that we don't know and we might not know for a long period of time when it comes to the coronavirus. Today, 1,827 people died. That's one thing that we know. That's pretty extraordinary, right? I feel like we almost need to like just take a deep breath collectively. And as you take your deep breath collectively, notice that you can breathe through your lungs. And you can, if you want, this is what my kids do. We check our foreheads every once in a while. Has anyone done that? Where when you get afraid that maybe you have the coronavirus, you just check if you have a fever. It's not the way you check if you have the coronavirus, but it's a great way to just say, I'm okay right now. And so I give you permission to wiggle your toes, to consume your nutrients, to drink enough liquids, to stay hydrated as we talk about this. But before we go too much further, let's see if I'm able to share my screen. I think I might be. Let's try this and see if it works. Does that work?
Yep.
All right, let me pull up. I had it pulled up on the other computer and then I moved it off. So give me just 1 second to pull this on. There we go. So these are the common symptoms of something called compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is typically something caregivers get when they have cared for someone with long-term health issues. It can also be something you get, it could be called burnout at your job.
Megan?
Yeah.
I'm not seeing a presentation. I'm just seeing your file manager.
You're just, okay. Well, Tom, I sent you this slideshow via email. Would you be willing to try and put it up?
Sure.
Because that might work better. Let's try that.
Let me see what I can do. Come on.
Are you
Or
on
should
two
I-
screens? Megan, are you on 2 screens?
Nope, just on one screen.
Okay.
I could see it on my screen, but that doesn't mean it's actually working.
Yeah, I can.
You have
get
to
it
select
done.
which app
Yeah.
which application you're sharing.
Yeah, the nice
I'll
thing about the introduction was that you know there's a long history of me saying, "Hey Tom, can you fix this?" So thankfully I sent the PowerPoint beforehand just to make sure.
Yeah, I just got it.
I'm glad you let me know though, because that would have been funny if you just pretended it was there, like I was the emperor with the new clothes. Or the
No.
Man of La Mancha. Have you guys seen the Man of La Mancha?
No, but we've got big mouths here, so you don't have to
Oh,
worry.
okay. No, I love it. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm guessing
So-
everybody on the screen is asked
There
Tom
you go.
to fix it.
Perfect.
Yes, good. We're all in the same company.
I'm gonna go. There we
I
go.
knew you could do it.
That's good graph.
Yeah. So, all right. So you got a reprieve for a second, but now read these 8 things. And if there's a second person in your house, it might be better if you're married if you don't say, "Oh yeah, that's you," at any of these symptoms, but you know. Ponder if you have any of these already. You might have had them before the coronavirus came into your life, but these are the common symptoms of just being stressed. And terms like compassion fatigue, or because I work with police officers a lot, they care for victims at the scene of a crime, but they don't like to be called victims. So they use terms like critical incidents for their stress. So I see that I have several of these. I also noticed that my family has several of these. It's just a good thing to think about, because if you are getting into fights with other people who are sheltering in place with you, it might be because of some of these 8 things rather than because they don't like sharing company with you.
Yes, okay.
And so I just wanted to show you some of the stress that might already be in your body, so that as we think about how to grieve together, as some of these deaths hopefully don't get closer to home, but in case they do, when we're trying to figure out how to have grief without groups, some of these things are going to come into play. You can take the screen down now, and then we'll come back to it in a second. So we know that some people have started having funerals, and that it's been hard to have funerals without being able to be physically with people. Some on this call might have a little bit of experience with things like this if you lived through the AIDS crisis, which I'm guessing most of you did. Not knowing if you can go to funeral homes or how infections are spread. At what can happen during times like this, kind of depending upon how your medical examiner's office works. Here in San Francisco, we actually do chaplaincy care for our medical examiners because they live at the medical examiner's office. They work 14-hour shifts, and then they sleep for 8, and then they work a 14-hour shift. So they work for 3 days, and then they're off for 4 days, which is a life I cannot imagine. But as you can, it's pretty easy to see why they might need chaplains to come check on them every once in a while. And so in our medical examiner's office, it's because it's larger and because they have special areas that have quarantine sections that have their own air filtration systems that don't share the air with the rest of the building. They could actually keep people there for up to a year so that they could have a normal funeral service. Other spaces aren't going to have that ability, and you might need to make a choice about cremated remains or burials not being able to be near spaces. Our Catholic colleagues have been advised that they're not allowed to do anointings for burial, which was a pretty crucial part of Catholic worship and Catholic end-of-life services, and so that's a pretty big change. They don't do hospital visits. They're allowed in some cases to do a graveside service as long as it's under 10 people who are in that space, but it just depends on what the current laws of your area are and what your medical examiner's office or coroner's office is allowing at that particular time. This is a time when some people are reevaluating their end-of-life plans that they had created. There are some people who said, I never want to be on oxygen, who are thinking about being on oxygen differently now, right? There are some people who have thought about how they wanted to be buried or what kind of funeral service they wanted, and they're thinking about that different now. Those are always things that you can talk through with your church leadership, or if you like revise those plans, you can just send a revision. My hunch is Tom will have more time after Monday than this week to talk about those, any sort of changes about that. But know that there are some options that can be done now, right? You guys are now experts in being on Zoom, so you could have some gatherings to talk about grief. There are a number of places that are posting free services. I think people with psychology degrees are feeling like they are very called to this moment. UCSF in San Francisco has posted several webinars for people. They're doing, one of the upcoming ones is going to be about the moral perspective of what's going on with this crisis. And there are a number of places that are doing like free self-care and free yogas and things like that that you can check in with that maybe you did already or maybe you didn't. What all of the science says, though, is that the things that helped you in the past are the things that are going to be the best for you now. You might learn a new instrument while you're hanging out with people stuck in your house, but it's more likely that if you have had grief before and something worked for you then, that same thing is going to be your best bet right now. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, just ponder when you have felt like this before, what worked. And that's kind of the number one for people who are in crisis. One thing that might be really different during this time as we're caring for people is to remember, I'm reminded of this because my kids are walking back and forth to see what I'm doing and pretending like they have to go to the bathroom right now, is that this might be a very different thing for us as people of faith to talk about grief with a lot of kids around. Just because some of us don't have places where our kids aren't listening through the doors. I know mine have admitted that they listen to every phone call I'm on to try to glean information. And so knowing like if there are ways that we can create a self-care routine for the 5 minutes we get when the bathroom door is shut, right? Or just know that most of the things that we'll be doing as we grieve might be in front of children, and that might be new. Or if you've got someone who loves youth and knows how to care for them and talk to them at appropriate different age levels, might be a really blessed time to have people who are really good at that. The thing though that I want to say is that my encouragement for you is not just to think about self-care during this time that we're sheltering at home, but to think about self-care for 3 years. And part of the reason for that, if you want to put up the second slide, Tom, is because the timeline of a crisis, of a typical crisis with just one major impact, like a car crash, looks like this. So the impact, where it says impact, that would be where a disaster happens. It could be like if it was a fire or an earthquake, that would be the moment that things happen. And this is kind of emotional well-being in how people are. So typically after the disaster is over, and maybe we're seeing it a little bit during the disaster, you have these periods where you notice that there's lots of heroes. And the community kind of rallies around people who are caregivers, people who have been doing extraordinary things. At the end of this, there might be some sort of big community sense that we're all in this together. I don't know if the video has come out yet, but there's always some sort of "we are the world" kind of feeling that comes out. You know what I'm talking about, after kind of a big disaster. So we might have a honeymoon period where we feel like, yeah, we did it, right? Because I'm a pastor, so I'm going to say we're going to be Easter about this virus, that we're going to have hope. So that's the honeymoon period, is when we all feel like we're super connected. And then if you've ever been to a funeral where you held it together when everyone was looking, and then as soon as they stopped asking, how are you? That's when you really started to feel the grief. That's that dip that happens, the disillusionment. Oh, they were here for me for a brief amount of time, and then everyone just went back to work and forgot about each other, right? It's that's a normal thing that kind of happens almost even chemically in our bodies, because when a disaster happens like this, we actually in our body get adrenaline and cortisol. That's like when an emergency happens and you're like, I can do this. Let's do this. Let's buy all the things. I don't know if you're like me. Let's go on Amazon. Let's get the right mask. Let's sew some stuff. Those are all beautiful coping skills, but in your body, it gives you both adrenaline and cortisol. And you feel really great. And then a couple of days later, that adrenaline and cortisol actually dumps out of your body, and you kind of get grumpy. For me, it's 3 days later. It might be different timing for you. And then something else exciting happens. You get adrenaline and cortisol. The adrenaline and cortisol that we get during an emergency or during a disaster is the same chemicals that people get when they give birth. And if you mapped out this timeline and you just changed delusionment to postpartum depression, we would have a social way of thinking about what happens when those chemicals leave our body. We don't necessarily have that same understanding about grief or about our mental health care. So let's go to the next slide, which is this same chart, but with feelings put in there. And the difficulty is that we're not having just one thing that happens and then it's over. This is happening over a really long period of time. We don't really have good scientific evidence about what happens in your body when a disaster happens over a longer period of time. But my hunch is that we might be experiencing little disasters on different days, right? If we hear about a death, that's one disaster. And so we might have many of these waves going on inside of us. And we also have the stuff we had all before this, right? Anniversaries of loved ones we lost even before this happened. So some of the things that can happen is tunnel vision. And that means, I know that I went out driving today. I dropped off some cards at the police station for Easter. And I had to physically turn my head to see all of the crosswalks because my peripheral vision had just shrunk a lot. And that's my body trying to keep me safe. Like, just focus on what you need to do right now. Stop trying to plan the whole world. And so my body's just narrowing my vision. You can get numbness in your fingertips. Anyone have numbness in their fingertips? My wife the other day was opening a can of coconut milk. She was going to make something that I'm sure would have been yummy. But she sliced her finger open so deep we got to go to the ER. And you can imagine how fun it is to go to the ER these days. So she said it was a little bit like being at the end of ET, where everyone was intense and had all the masks on. And she got the fastest 5 stitches anyone's ever gotten in an ER. But part of that is that during a disaster like this, anyone bumping into walls when they walk through doorways, right? Or knocking all their stuff over on the desk. And that's partly just because all of our attention has gone to our brain to try to keep us safe, or has gone to just breathing normally because we're stressed and our heart rates have gone up. And so we have to think more about breathing at the normal rate. And so we can actually injure ourselves more from just the effects of stress than simply just being sick. And so irritability, I know, I can tell just because you are fine, faithful people, none of you are irritable ever. Not before this, not after this. Right? Memory loss.
Right.
When we're in trauma like this, when we're in a disaster, our memories actually imprint in a different portion of our brain than normal. So right now, all the memories you're having are going in a different part of your brain, and it's a part of your brain that you don't control when you're going to have those memories. So they just pop back whenever they want to. And so that can be a strange thing. So if you have a partner who has told you you're forgetting everything, you can tell them, Pastor Megan said it's because of the coronavirus stress. And if they say you did this before, just say, no, I don't know. I don't remember that. That's always a good answer when someone says you're not remembering things. So these waves of feelings can last. This is the chart for up to a year after something ends, right? That these feelings can happen inside of us. And the waves on the bottom of the chart are stuff that could just come and go at any time. And that could be stuff that happens in dreams. It could be not sleeping very well. It could be lots of different stuff. It's just zoning out, forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink, or eating and drinking too much, right? When we try to control the chemicals in our body, the adrenaline and the cortisol makes us feel good. When it flushes out of our system, we feel bad. And so for some people, they want to put more adrenaline and more cortisol in their system. Some people use caffeine. Some people might use alcohol. Those things in and of themselves aren't overly problematic. However, there is some science that says that everyone kind of has to go through the bad feeling of what happens when all that adrenaline and cortisol leaves your system. And if you drink caffeine or if you drink alcohol, it will take 3 times as long for those bad feelings to come out of your system. I'm definitely not going to tell Lutherans not to drink coffee, but I do think just know that that's a thing that could happen. So if you find yourself being really overwhelmed by feelings or by stress, one thing you could try is decreasing caffeine. So that's just something to try. Will you go to the next slide? I'll just get all the slides out of the way. So these are some of the stages of grief that we expect, not only if a person has died, but just like it can also be grief of loss of the freedom to leave our house, grief from the loss of being in our workspace or loss of jobs. Shock is when you kind of just feel paralyzed. Denial is when you just can't believe that something has happened. Anger, again, none of you experienced that, so we're fine. Testing is one that not a lot of people always put on their grief chart, but it's one that I add. Testing is when you are only going to, so, well, here's the way to say it, is it's always good to double check if what you're reading online is a valid source, right? It's always good to check if the news you're watching is a valid source. Testing is when you are, it's not testing to see if something is reasonable. It's more like when my children try to be bad to see if I'll still love them if they're bad, right? It's easier to have examples that are about relationships, like, yeah, but you wouldn't love me if I da 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 da, right? That's kind of a test. But we can also do that. We can, I've had people do that in crisis situations with me as a pastor, and they'll ask me like deep questions about the Bible before they decide if I'm really a pastor or not. It's not personal. It's just that people don't feel safe and they don't know what to trust, and they're looking for tangible ways that they can figure out what is safe and what to trust. At any time, you could switch very quickly through any of these things. And that means that, for example, if you have to tell people we can't have a funeral right now in person, we have to wait until the shelter in place is over, the amount of anger that someone could have could be amplified by their grief. And for me as a chaplain, I tend to take anger as a sign that I'm doing well at my job. You can ask my congregation whether or not they think it's okay that I have translated the fact that they're angry at me sometimes to the sign that I'm doing well at my job. But in this crisis, many of us have very few choices. We don't get to choose when we leave our house. We don't get to choose where we can shop. We don't get to choose, we might not get to choose who can visit us in the hospital. We might not get to choose our course of treatment. We might not get to choose a whole lot of things. And so if someone is able to say no to me, even if it's grumpy, I always see that as as a chaplain or as a faithful person, am the one person that they feel safe enough being angry with, because I can't fire them. I'm not going to stop loving them. Jesus said I'm supposed to pray for those who are my enemy, right? So if I'm in a house and my kids hear every phone conversation, it's really hard to vent, right? And so sometimes anger is just that venting that needs to come out. I also think because we're people who are actively trying to be good in the world or actively trying to be kind in the world, that we might not be as good at sitting with our anger and not being afraid of it. We might have learned to swallow our anger or to not say what we mean. And so sometimes if you put any of these feelings into a hidey hole and don't pay attention to them, they're bound to kind of come out bigger. So those are the slides I wanted to show you, and feel free, Tom, if anyone wants to take a look at them, to send them to anyone who wants to see them too. You can take it down. That was a lot, right? So I guess what I'm hoping to like think about with you all is, what are some ways that we can think about grief together? What are some ways that we can care for people in the middle of it's hard to even imagine. Like, it's hard for me to tangibly believe that 1,827 people died in the United States today because I can't leave my house, and people feel so far away from me. And so I have some ideas about how we can grieve together as a group. And I wonder if you guys have some ideas about how we can grieve together as a group. Part of what I think is helpful is just actually saying the word death and died out loud in a group, because I think sometimes we don't say it directly. If you have loved ones around you and they don't know what your wishes are for how you imagine the end of your life could be, this could be a time to share that. And so, but we also, our tendency is going to be to tunnel vision during this time as well. Yeah. Do you want me to talk a little bit more about my ministry? I see that up in the chat box.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So when I was ordained in 2006, hard to believe, I was working with the chronically homeless in San Francisco on Polk Street, if you're familiar with San Francisco. I did that for about 12 years, and it was a very creative ministry. During that time, I wanted to learn more about what it was like for those I was ministering to. And so our way that we cared for the homeless was to always eat with them instead of serving people. So we would bring them food and then eat with them. And then, even though at the time I started working with the homeless when I was 21, straight out from South Dakota, I think I got the job because I had been a black belt and they thought maybe I could handle it. And so we would always eat with people. And even though I was young, I think I felt like my role was to be the grandmother, the person who would be a cheerleader for them regardless of whatever happened in their life, and to just check in on them every week. And so I would serve about 200 people every other Saturday and about 40 people every Tuesday and Thursday. And we also did some creative projects. We took an empty St. Paul's Lutheran Church burned down in 1993, and it was just this empty pit. And we transformed that empty pit into a garden made from trash and grew 4 tons of produce with the homeless, in part because I thought it would be a great poem if there was one church that was alive, because it was gardens. Because it was around that time that everyone was like, is your church alive or is your church not alive? And so I liked the pun of it being produce. We actually made a labyrinth over the spot where their narthex or the baptismal font used to be. And so we used the bricks of the old church, and we put mental health healing herbs in it. And I actually baptized someone whose mother worked all her life and hadn't had time to get her baptized, and they were Lutheran. And we baptized her with the garden hose in the center of the labyrinth, which was really cool. And everyone kind of holding hands around her and praying with her. And we did a project where we got 150 people their IDs, because you needed your driver's license to get your birth certificate and your birth certificate to get your driver's license. And at the time they had changed the rules, so people weren't able to get housing or any benefits because they didn't have their IDs. But California law said at the time, if the person was personally known to me, I could notarize their identification forms. So because I had been eating with the homeless for years, I knew their names. And so I became a notary, and I could help them. We helped, I think, over 150 people get into housing just because I notarized their ID forms. We also worked on a project where we got people free eyeglasses. We got one of those machines where they say like number 1, number 2. And it was a traveling machine. We'd take it from place to place and get people prescriptions, because we kind of thought it was the closest to Jesus healing people's eyesight that we could find. And I got pretty smart at that point in my ministry. We partnered with the big island of Hawaii, because they have a very high homeless rate of Native Hawaiians who have a higher than disproportionate rate of diabetes, but people wouldn't get tested. But in order to get an eye exam, you sometimes have to get a diabetes test. And so I had to suffer for 3 years. I went to the Big Island of Hawaii, and you have to stay at least a week because the airline flights are cheaper. And then we would get like 170 homeless Hawaiians eyeglasses. Then I worked at an Episcopal church for a little bit, and we did creative music masses. The idea was for people who had left the church because they were injured by the church, people who had told them that for some reason God could not love them and it had wounded them at some point in their life. We would have big fancy worship services that would like make the newspapers, but the whole point of that service, we would integrate some of these trauma healing science into the worship service, and then they would kind of join the regular church service. So we started with Lady Gaga Mass, if you can believe it. But the favorite is Beatles Mass, and we've been doing that while we're at home. And there's also a Bob Dylan Mass, just because I like to show off that I can play the harmonica and the guitar at the same time. And I started working as a chaplain for the police department 3 years ago. They had always had Irish Catholic chaplains, and some of the LGBT members of the police department wondered what would happen if they died and if they would have a funeral, and how their family would be treated if they died. And so they asked if I would be their pastor, and I didn't know how to say no to that. That's a pretty good reason. And so I've done that for the last 3 years. I started as a police chaplain, and then they hired me to create a program to provide chaplaincy to people who are grieving during 911 calls. So we send all kinds of different people of faith to the house of someone if a first responder requests them in order to care for people while they're grieving. And so that's a lot of what I do. So over the last month, I think we've been focusing on mental health care for the first responders themselves. And we just finished creating a phone call-in line for the employees of San Francisco General Hospital, who are kind of on the front lines of the coronavirus right now. Yeah.
That's awesome. So Megan, Tony has another question
Yeah.
about how do you, what about homeless people who are dealing with the COVID-19 situation? What kind of things are you guys doing with them?
So here in San Francisco, there's a lot of groups that are working on trying to get everyone indoors. They've put a lot of the people who are in shelter situations into hotel rooms. And they've also expanded the number of shelter services. So the people who are at high risk of getting the coronavirus, who might already have like respiratory issues or who are seniors, are going into really large, giant like convention centers where they can sleep a certain number of feet apart, but also be regularly checked out by nurses so that if they do get sick, they can kind of get care as soon as possible. There are some people who are trying to see if they can get 100% of the homeless in San Francisco moved indoors. And it will be interesting to see if San Francisco figures out how to make that happen. One of the difficulties here is that if you live indoors for more than 29 days in a row, you have tenancy rights. And so the difficulty to figure out is how would you stop paying a hotel bill after the coronavirus isn't a threat anymore for someone who has tenants rights in a hotel? And so that's a really complicated issue for the city to figure out. But I think there's more generosity right now than there was 5 months ago and 6 months ago. And so there's something really hopeful about people paying attention to that. It's hard because we don't know all of the medical facts yet about how the coronavirus works. So what we don't know is, are you better off being alone outside where you're not around? Are you better off sheltering in place outside or in a hotel with other people a certain number of feet away. We don't know that yet. And so we really want to help people, but it's hard when you don't know all the medical facts, because something you believe might be helpful might actually be harmful later. So I think I just think it's a really hard thing. I've personally decided that because of the training that I have and because of my work with first responders, my police officers that I work with are so nervous right now that their work is a death sentence in a different way, right? They have learned skills for dealing with burglars. They've learned skills for what to do if you're hopping over a fence. There's no skill or tool or thing you can put in a belt that protects you from the coronavirus other than wearing masks. And we know that some people who've been wearing masks still contract the virus. And so one of the things that I'm doing kind of for their sake is I'm sheltering at home and trying to leave as little as possible, so that when the grief work is needed afterwards, they know that I'm healthy and safe and in a place where I can care for them. And I think, I pray that we won't have to do that, but I think it might just be a matter of time before we have a first responder who needs a pretty big funeral service. Prior to the coronavirus, that would have been a huge to-do. There would have been horses and SWAT teams and just thousands of people in a church service. And so it's going to be a very different way of grieving for our first responders to not be able to do that. On Monday, I'm going to go to some of the police departments and actually bless them before their shift that day. And I went to last week we had a graduation of new police officers, about 17 of them, and they all sat 6 feet apart from each other and looked like the most terrified humans. They always do when they graduate and they're about to be police officers. But it was a special kind of thing. And they wanted to be blessed by a chaplain before they began their service, so that they felt like if something did happen in harm's way, that they were given the best shot possible in terms of blessings. But yeah, the homeless stuff is super complicated right now.
Do any of you have questions you want to ask?
I'm a pastor. I could just talk a long time.
Oh yeah, they're pros.
Oh, I think your mute's on.
Yeah, go ahead and unmute yourself and talk.
I was wondering, are the people who are homeless, how much awareness do they have of the virus and the dangers, and what kind of options do they have to protect themselves?
So one of the things that we have done in San Francisco is they've added outdoor hand washing stations and outdoor bathrooms in places that didn't used to have them. And I think the goal was to have one hand washing station for every 50 individuals. So that's a really huge change for people to be able to wash their hands pretty regularly. We have homeless outreach teams, and we also have a crisis team for the Department of Public Health. So we have kind of roving social workers and mental health professionals who just normally go out and chat with people. We also have the San Francisco Night Ministry, which I've also gone out and walked with. They go out every night from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m. And so there have been a lot of people who have done kind of education work about what's happening. You'd be surprised how many homeless people actually read the Chronicle from front to back all day. So there is a number of folk who are very highly educated in what's going on. But then I live near Golden Gate Park, like 2 blocks away from, maybe 6 blocks away from where the buffalo are, if you want to know where on a map specifically, right? So there are a number of people who live in Golden Gate Park in like places you'd never find them, even if you like looked really hard. Their whole goal in life is just to not be bothered by people. They probably know less about the coronavirus, but probably because they're living like hermits they might outlive us all, right? Because they're just so deeply kind of always isolated and quarantined. There's also, because our homeless population here in San Francisco, 80% has pretty chronic mental health conditions. There are some people who their mental health is coming out in ways that is pretty, you know, if you want the police officers to stay away from you, if you want other humans to stay away from you, man, just start coughing and telling people you have a disease right now, right? Which is both scary and hooray, they can stay protected and have their own different distance. So it's kind of a full range of, it probably also depended on what the awareness level people had beforehand. I knew a number of people when I was eating with the homeless who actually, when they were born, were placed into residential care facilities because their IQ was below the level of what was thought to be someone you should ever live with in your home. And then when all of those facilities were closed, there wasn't any sort of provision or adult protective services where they could live indoors. So there's a number of people who just cognitively, not through any fault of their own, might not be able to understand fully what's going on right now. But we've had a really low infection rate compared to what you would expect in a city as populated as San Francisco. And so hopefully it's because people are taking precautions. I saw today in the paper, Stanford is doing a study that it might have come here in January, and that several of us might have already gotten some of the antibodies that help us fight it. And so we're superhuman awesome because we live around here. But because so much of the health stuff is kind of guessing at this point, it's so hard to know.
Megan, one of the questions Susan has is,
yeah,
do you have any insights in helping people who with caregiving grief? So us as caregivers, what are some suggestions?
Well, there's lots of different types of caregiver grief, right? There's many of us where we are right now might have both children and parents that we're taking care of at the same time. Is the kind of grief we're talking about because we've lost someone or because we feel overwhelmed because we're currently caregivers? Do you know that?
Megan, I think it's the idea of how do we, and as I look at the people on the call, a lot of us are caregivers by nature.
Yes.
And so how do we not some of the other, not the direct caregiving, the grief, not necessarily the traditional death, but the sense of we can't care like we normally do for our community. And I think, how do we help keep ourselves healthy, especially as this belongs?
So there's a couple of things that you can do. So since I became a chaplain for the police department, I've really changed how I forgive myself for not being able to do as much as my brain thinks I should. And the way that I do that is really perfect for the visual on our Zoom call right now, is look at how many of you there are. And I want to give you permission right now to just do your part, right? And you might be like me. I've decided intentionally that the part I'm going to do is after the shelter in place is over, and you gotta give yourself permission to not be the person who does every food bank or who doesn't do every single volunteer opportunity. There's a member in my congregation who's raising money to get masks for everyone, and I donated to it, but I don't have the time to like email it to everybody. Like I just can't right now. Because, so the reason I played that slide at the beginning that shows you all of those symptoms is to hopefully have reminded you that you are going through the trauma yourself as well. I've been on a lot of Zoom calls where people have said, well, we have to prepare for when other people die. When we all know, right? We did Ash Wednesday together, right? We put the dust on our forehead and we said, we are dust, and to the dust we shall return. We know that we are just as susceptible as everyone else that we're worried about. I don't know about you, but when we get groceries delivered, I count the number of days afterwards to make sure I know that grocery delivery wasn't a way that we brought coronavirus into our house, right? And so you gotta allow yourself to do less. I'll send you another link, Tom, from some webinars that UCSF's psychology department is doing. I listened to one yesterday, and it's advertised as being for healthcare workers and how they can manage their stress. But I just thought it was really wonderful to give us all permission, particularly if we're normally caring for other people, how to be people who care for ourselves. One of the bits of advice that they gave that I found really helpful is that stop trying to work like we're not in the middle of an emergency. Every hour, you should take a 15-minute break, right? Because your brain just can't sit down for 8 hours and process all that stuff. Set a timer, do whatever. It could be an art break. It could be like walking around. It could be because you forgot your body existed and you didn't even go to the bathroom, right, in hours. And so think of doing things in smaller chunks than you might have been doing them. Like if babies do this thing, have you ever tried to like get a baby to look at you and to giggle at you? Babies do this thing that they don't even think about, and that's that when they're overstimulated by what we're doing, they will just look away and stop, and they will give their brain a break, and then they will come back to you and they'll get stimulated again, and then they'll look away and they'll take a break. And so give yourself permission to zone out, especially if Tom tries to preach. Give yourself
Never, ever.
Give yourself permission, right? Give yourself permission to stop talking. Like if someone's talking to you about something that's stressful and you're like, I'm done hearing about death, Pastor Megan, just start looking, figure out what people have in the back of their house, right? Like what books are on their bookshelf, right? You don't have to pay attention. Like it's recorded. You could watch it again if you feel you want to hear it twice, right? But just give yourself permission. And I also want to remind you that you also had that permission when you were in your original sanctuary, right? Sanctuaries are designed for you to zone out and still be on topic, sort of, right? Here, this is my background. This is stained glass windows that my kids colored, right? Because we wanted to always be streaming live from my house to remind other people that they should stay in their house. But we also wanted to let them zone out by looking at something pretty, right? Palm Sunday, I did a bunch of research. Palm Sunday in some places is called Flower Day. So we used it as an excuse to get a whole bunch of flowers all over the house. And we've not been sad about it, except the cats try to eat it. And it's annoying to try to get the cats to stop eating the plants, right? So if you can put good distractions near you, you don't need it. I mean, no one in the world needs more annoying distractions in their house, right? But think about all 7 of your senses, right? Might be one time in your life you can work with your preferred smell in the area, right? This might be the one time in your life you can pick the textures on your body for real that are comfortable, right? Might be the one time in your life that you can put up things that you think are pretty, even if other people don't agree. Unless you're married, then, work it out. But, right, it might be the one time in your life you get to pick the temperature you like at your workplace or where you're hanging out. And so the more you can pay attention to all the senses that you have in your body, the more present you'll be right now. Trauma isn't, it's not like an injury where your body is broken. Trauma just means that something that was unsafe in the past feels unsafe right now. That unsafeness in the past was true. It's not true now, right? Trauma is just a feeling in your body being out of sync with time. So the more you can be here and now, wherever you are, the better you are. And there's actually a bit of science that says if you just turn your head so that the back of your brainstem moves. Do it right now. Look at something weird in your house that you're glad's not on screen that no one can see. Yep, everybody's got something in their house, right? Look up at the light fixture. Are there bugs in your light fixture? Probably. Everybody's got them, right? Are there cobwebs in the corner of your house? just turning the back of your head decreases your stress. Even if you don't think kind thoughts when you turn your head, even if you're not thinking of Jesus when you turn your head, just there's actual whole scientific manuals about it just turning your head, right? And so the good news is there's like way more reading on our planet about how to take care of yourself than maybe ever existed a month ago. But just that simple act of checking out what's going on. Does anyone else have an iPhone watch?
Yeah.
It's just Tom. My iPhone watch goes off every hour, and my iPhone watch can tell when I'm stressed out and will tell me to breathe.
Wow.
Maybe
I
you
turned
have it.
that off.
Yeah, I figured. I was going to say you probably turned it off. But it has figured out, did you know there's an optimal way to breathe a certain number of seconds in? You don't have to do any of this weird stuff. I can never remember which one's the left nostril and the right when I do those weird breathing things. But if you breathe in for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and out for 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In for 4, 2, 3, 4, and out for 6. Just doing that pattern can help bring your stress levels down. You don't have to believe in any of it, but it's still going to work with your heart rate and with your breathing. So, so that's a couple of tricks that you can just do, is to just like, my iPhone will also tell me I'm supposed to stand up like 10 minutes before the end of every hour. And sometimes I'm like mad at my phone for telling me to stand up, but you could just like turn your head instead for a couple minutes, and hopefully it'll help things.
You just fake it out. You just raise your hand up and shake it a bunch.
Yeah, we're going to be really drawn to TV and stories that are going to bump our chemicals back up. So that's going to, like, everyone's going to watch movies about tigers and whether or not people killed their spouses, right? Because that's going to be, right? But just know a couple days later, it's going to go again, right? And so if you have control of the remote, put it on those. It's a time for comedies about burping and farting, right? It's a time for things. Keep up with the Kardashians, because you don't have to, you can zone out and you will not have missed the plot, right? Anything that helps you laugh is great. Anything that is less about what is stressing you out. Although my kids are backwards. They were having nightmares for a long time about people breaking into the house, and it helped after they watched Home Alone, because he like throws things at burglars, right? So at the beginning of the coronavirus, they were really scared, so we watched Outbreak, and that was more about answering their questions about how you quarantine and things like that. So that's probably a bad place to get your science information.
Hey, Megan, Mark had a good question.
Yeah.
So it's about differences. So the question was, what's a recommendation one person wants to read about and talk about the virus and the other doesn't? So you're in a place where you got different soothing mechanisms, different ways to cope.
So I think the assumption behind this question that just like straightforward telling that person you don't want to talk about it doesn't feel like a fun thing to do. Right?
I'm not going to read into that, but that could be one thing.
I think there are some kind of subtle ways that you can help people by just kind of expressing where your limit is like, if you feel like you could say, you know, I'm trying to take a break from some of the coronavirus talk. I'm kind of overwhelmed with conversation about that, but can you tell me a little bit about this?
Or you could always fall back to the old, hey, how about those Giants?
Yeah, I mean,
Change
except
the subject right now.
Sadness that they might or might not be playing soon, right?
I think some of it is different people need different amounts of time to process and ways that we do that. So how to have that balance.
Yep.
You know, they said some things are going to happen is babies are going to go way up and divorces are going to go way up. So, you know, how do we manage those times?
Yeah, I give you, so one of the things that I fail to do a lot that I should do more often is after someone says a thing that's kind of heavy, because it gives you a second to not say the quick bitey thing that usually is the first in my brain. None of you, I'm sure, ever think those things. But it gives you a second to like pull back. One of the things that there's an author, Peter Levine, he writes a book called Catching the Tiger. I'll send you a link to the book. Approaching the Tiger, something like that. He invented a type of trauma care that's called somatic experiencing. And that somatic just means it's like in your body, that it's about feeling it. So it's a type of care in an emergency that's not about telling stories. It's about just checking in with what's going on in your body. And they do something called pouncing on the positive, right? So I have an uncle who all he ever wants to talk about is what is terrible in the world. So right now that might be the coronavirus. He'll bring up Donald Trump just to try to make people mad, and he'll say it, and he won't even care, like whatever side your politics is, he'll bring it up in the way that makes you mad, right? And you might have a person like that in your life, the person you think whether or not they should come to Thanksgiving dinner, right? So what you do with a person like that and is to try to wait them out, right? People, you don't have to say anything about coronavirus, but they might just keep talking about it. As soon as they say something that they like, even slightly positive, ask them a million questions about that positive thing, right? So if they're like, I hate the coronavirus, but now I know I love taffy, you're like, tell me about taffy. What color taffy? What kind of taffy? And what you're doing is rewarding them for talking about something positive with your interest, right? And then you're not saying, stop talking about that, I can't stand it. What you are doing is just kind of feeding the conversation in the direction that is something that you like. And it might not work the first phone call or conversation with them, but over time they're going to figure out that you're really only going to show interest in the parts that are positive. And I have one congregant who is just right at the edge of dementia. And so he's easily irritated in a way that he doesn't always have control over. And I'll just let him go. Like, you know, you could do like a pastor response, like, or oh. Tom doesn't do that, I hope. Or I just outed him. But so you can do that. But once they say something like, oh, I just love photography, that's when you really are like, photography, I'm going to learn everything about photography. The Giants, if they love the Giants, like, so that's where like finding a thing that they can like can be really helpful. And then I also give you permission, if someone keeps talking about negative stuff, to just like call them less, or like wait to return their phone call until you have space for that.
I think that's good.
Right?
So Chris put up the book title. It's Waking the Tiger.
Yes.
Healing Trauma by Peter A. Levine. So thank you, Chris Larson.
Good job. I knew it had tigers.
And then Tony also brought up a good point, which I totally agree with, and I'm finding that for myself. So sometimes you're just on overload, listening to the news and being stimulated. And I go through waves of yelling at the radio sometimes and doing things. I'm like, I can't believe I'm I'm yelling at a radio. I mean, that's just an inanimate object.
Yep.
So that idea of taking a break and limiting your time that you do those things, and that's going to be different for every person.
Yeah, I also think this is a time where having a tangible task is important. Someone was working on sewing. Having something that has a completion at the end that you can celebrate that the thing is done. Puzzles can do this, unless your cats are like my cats and they destroy the puzzle while you're sleeping. It's infuriating. Anything that is small and manageable, it's better if it's a task that like decreases your stress. But if there's like something around the house you haven't fixed in forever, and like now's the time because you're stuck in the house, just anything that you can do that has a tangible beginning and end. For some people, it's washing the dishes. For me, it's washing other people's dishes that aren't my own dishes, right? That sense of I did it and it's done. figure out what that is for you, because if you can find things that you can have control over right now, particularly things that help you feel good, that's kind of what we all are needing right now, is to know that there's some things that are within our control, that we are functioning, right? That we are getting things done. To even be able to mark that time is passing. Like, see, I know that I've done something useful because now I have a full sweater set for everyone in our congregation. Yeah, any sort of thing that has tangible completion, because so much of this is so uncertain. It's hard.
So true.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Is it possible to show those 8 common symptoms of compassion, that first screen?
Mhm.
I didn't really get enough of it.
Yeah. Well, especially because remember I said you were going to have short-term memory as well.
It's this one, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And I will have these slides that I'll be able to share with all you guys.
Compassion fatigue is its own resource. Like part of what I want to do is also like use language so that when you like Google later, you can be like, oh yeah, what was compassion fatigue? Compassion fatigue will now in your Google searches provide you with a whole different type of self-care than you might get just from like depression or a car crash. But I do think compassion fatigue is probably a lot of what we're experiencing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I want to respect Megan's time that they've offered for us. Any last questions that anybody would like to ask, or I'm sure we can get a hold of them down the road too. Any last ones? Okay. Megan, I really appreciate you being here. Would you be willing to close us in prayer? Because you're like the official pastor person, so it's your job.
All right. I would love to. Loving God, enfold us with your love in a way that seals out any viruses. Wrap our hearts in saran wrap so that we know we are loved and held tight. Protect us from all harm and keep us safe. Tickle our funny bone every once in a while so we have a sense of humor, and help us to be as patient as we can during times like these. We know that when we mourn, you have called us blessed, but we also know that we can call you into account, that we can ask for suffering to end, that we can ask you to shepherd us out of this. Be with us, be in us, and be working through us. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah.
This was a real treat and really spoke to our hearts and our souls. So blessings on your ministry as you continue to do hard work. And I know you have a friend down here in the South Bay with all of us.
Absolutely. Love you
Thank
guys. Stay
you.
safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Megan, thank you.
absolutely.